want to start this article by looking at the definitions at the top. Okay? So the definition of volition, right? Which again, these are words that we don't often use, kind of in common discourse and common communication with others. Excuse me. But volition, the exercise of the will. Okay? So that's how these articles, Hull and Sloan, are defining this. The exercise of the will. Now, notice right below it then is the definition of the will, right? The faculty by which a person decides on or initiates action. Control or restraint, deliberately exerted, or a desire or intention. Okay, so focusing here on the word intention. Okay? And the question is, like, what is volition and what is the will? Okay? And when are they reflected in our behavior? Is the will apparent when we act impulsively to attain that which we desire? Or is it apparent when we restrain those impulses, choosing to forego attempting desert by sheer willpower, which is, again, kind of control exercised by deliberate purpose? Excuse me. Okay? And what are the effects of external agents such as drugs or alcohol on our ability to exert one's will? In attempting to answer these questions, we will think it useful to adopt a system of theories, yada, yada, yada. Okay? But these are some of the questions that I think are worth asking, right? Okay? What is volition and what is the will? And when are they reflected in behavior? Okay? And interestingly, this article goes through both kind of, the restraint that one shows over making a decision or not making a decision as a signpost to enacting and showcasing the intention of the will, right? That if I'm presented with a beer and I'm like, no, I'm not drinking today, or no, I've already had 2 beers, like, to what extent does that exercise and demonstrate volition, right? Which is the exercise of the will, which is the faculty by which a person decides on or initiates action, okay? And so they're making the claim here, right? Like, is the will apparent when we act impulsively to attain that which we desire, or is it apparent when we restrain those impulses? Okay, so again, there's a difference here. And then below there, under the section called Overview, they make this other observation or this other kind of definitional work of controlled and uncontrolled behavior. Okay? Yada, yada, yada. This distinction between controlled versus automatic, yada, yada, yada. In addition to being uncontrolled, automatic behavior is often held to be unintentional, non-conscious, and effortless. Okay? So uncontrolled connected with being unintentional, non-conscious, and effortless. In contrast, controlled behavior is held to be intentional, conscious, and effortful. Okay? And notice, again, there's where is it? Oh my gosh. There's this focus on intention. Okay? All right. So those are some of the definitional kind of signposts I want us to have as we move forward. And I'm actually going to skip through a couple of pages here. They go through a couple of different psychological systems of maybe measuring the will, of assessing controlled, uncontrolled behavior, the perceptual, the inference, the motivational, and all of that I think is interesting, but for the sake of time, for the sake of getting to where I want to get to, I want to move to page 58, where they bring up alcohol intoxication as a disorder of volition. Okay? All right. Pardon me. Alcohol intoxication as a disorder of volition. Okay? So this is the opening of a door that allows us to ask that question, right? Because often when we think of alcohol use, people, for right reason, will say, oh, you're just being reckless. Oh, or you're not thinking straight. Or, oh, you don't have that much control over what it is you're doing, therefore alcohol is bad, right? Like there's lots of assumptions that are often made in this kind of opening door, right? That in a way, when we open the door to alcohol use, we're distorting, or adjusting to, pardon me, I'm sorry, excuse me, sorry about that. We are distorting, or we are kind of misplacing kind of our clear-minded, sober intention. But the authors make a couple of observations that actually are quite interesting. Okay? So this is at the bottom of page 58. People are assumed to behave in a variety of ways that they would not in a sober state, right? Okay. In restricting ourselves to the impact of alcohol intoxication on disorders of volition, the reader should take note of multiple other ways in which alcohol may be related to volitional behavior. Okay, now this sentence is kind of interesting. In restricting ourselves to the impact of alcohol intoxication on disorders of volition, the reader should take note of multiple other ways in which alcohol may be related to volitional behavior, meaning that alcohol actually could and does influence the exercise of the will, right? Because, alcohol, the way that it's a depressant, but the way that it stimulates might actually encourage behavior in ways that might not exist in a sober state. Again, for both kind of pros and cons here, right, which is part of the discussion. So at the bottom of 58, in restricting ourselves to the impact of alcohol intoxication and disorders of volition, the reader should take note of the multiple ways in which alcohol may be related to volitional behavior. Elsewhere, we provided a more complete review of these literatures. Individuals who lack willpower, self-control, are more likely to experience problems with drinking and alcohol dependence, right? That seems to stay consistent from what we peripherally know, of what we peripherally know, or what we firsthand know, right? Yada, yada, yada. But I want to go down to E here on 59. Excuse me. Now let me read this here. Alcohol-related behavior is not simply a consequence of the intoxicated state, but in part stems from the cognition that one has consumed alcohol. Having a handy excuse for inappropriate behavior, one is now free to engage in a variety of socially disapproved actions that one personally desire to enact. In other words, drinking becomes a vehicle of volitionally engaging in disapproved actions without accepting personal responsibility. Far from a disorder of volition, then, alcohol can serve as a facilitator of volition. Okay, so again, this is kind of dense and there's a lot going on here. But let's think about this, right? And then they bring up aggression and they bring up sex. And we'll talk about that more specifically in just a moment. But if it is the case that alcohol can influence one's identity, let's just kind of put it that way, okay? That if I am out and about, and if I'm out and about and I have a couple of beers, okay, and I become buzzed. I'm not drunk, but buzzed, right? And that was my volition, right, to go out to choose, and I exerted the will, the faculty by which a person decides on uninitiated actions. Like I used my will and my willpower to order drinks, to drink them, yada yada yada. But now that I've had a couple beers and I'm feeling a bit different than I was when I walked into the bar, right? That I'm buzzed, I'm a little bit heightened, I don't know, like feeling maybe a little more jolly. Now to what extent do I have a different volition, right? Now to what extent do I have a different volition where I might behave differently than I otherwise would in a sober state, right? Like I still have volition, like I'm still, aware of myself, aware of my surroundings, aware to some extent of how my actions are being gauged by others, by how how my actions are engaged with others. Like, but the question is, or like kind of what they're making this argument, or at least kind of drawing our awareness to, is the fact that now we have a new volition due to the consumption of alcohol, right? And sometimes those actions that are more risky, I mean, maybe that's the best word to put here, actions that are most risky, right? Such as, especially like decisions as they relate to sex. Perhaps now that I'm a bit buzzed or even drunk, right, the way that I think about decisions as it relates to sex might have a different volition, right? Might have a different kind of exercise of the will than they would had I been sober. Okay? And kind of what, we sometimes do in this move is like we make an excuse. We say, oh, well, I was drunk, so I'm going to be excused for that behavior. Or, especially as it relates to like aggression. Like, oh, man, I got really aggressive, towards that person, but normally that's not me, right? That was the alcohol. That was the booze talking. But we can't mitigate the fact that there was still volition in what it was you were doing. There was still volition in what it was that you were engaging with, even after consuming alcohol. Okay? And so, like this last sentence in E, on page 59, far from a disorder of volition, then, alcohol can serve as a facilitator of volition. The list of observations makes it clear that A, volitionally impaired individuals may drink alcohol because they are volitionally impaired, drinking because of reduced willpower. And B, volitionally unimpaired individuals may choose to drink alcohol because they are volitionally unimpaired, drinking as a willful act. Yada, yada, yada. Drinking alcohol makes individuals volitionally impaired, right? And so, drinking yields a disorder of the will. So that's at least like in the parenthetical here. Then the next part specifically talks about aggression and sex, which I will talk about in the next video.